imagine you're a Python dev, you're sitting at your desk, you're there banging away lines of code. Everything seems cool until bam, out of nowhere, you get an error. Well, fear not, because Python has got you covered with something called exception handling. We've all been there, and in this episode, you're going to learn how to use it. That's right, guys. Welcome back to another episode of Code with Josh. If you're looking for me, or you're looking to learn to code, you're in the right place. If you like my little intro, and before I get into the episode, why not hit that subscribe button and even the like button to help my channel grow? Before we get into today's episode, I have made a free guide for you guys. That's right, a handcrafted Python guide. It's the first link somewhere in the description. Well, it's at the top because it's the first link. Head on down there and grab yourself a copy. That's going to help you through your programming journey. All right, you guessed it. This episode is all about exception handling, but only brushing the surface. The goal of my videos is not to overwhelm you, but to inform you and try to make Python as fun as I can while breaking down complex tasks. Now, if you're just looking for the fancy slides that I've put together for you, it's somewhere in the timestamp. But before I get to the slides, I want to touch on a key few things. Why do we even need exception handling? Let's face it, bugs happen, no matter how carefully you craft your code. Now, really, the code might work perfectly because you're the programmer. You understand it. But let's face it, you're not the one that's going to be using the code. Becoming good at exception handling is going to allow you to achieve three major things. Number one, it helps prevent crashes in your application. If you predict an error before it happens, you're going to help predict that and prevent a crash. Number two, it increases the user experience because, like I said, let's face it, you're not making the application for you. Or maybe you are. But to increase the overall user experience, let's catch those errors as they happen and treat them the right way. And then lastly, exception handling is great for debugging and troubleshooting in your application. Let's jump on over into the slides that I've made for you, and let's talk more about exception handling in Python. Great, now that I'm in the slides, as I mentioned previously, exception handling is just identifying the potential problem before it even occurs. So ask yourself, what could a user do to trigger an error? That's it. There are two main types of errors. Now, number one, we've all seen it. It's a critical error. And essentially what this means is the terminal is going to identify these errors and tell you. So anytime you've gotten an error down there in your terminal, it tells you exactly the line and the type of error and even where the error is happening. That's an error that your IDE, like VS Code, can pick up on. The other error is really a hidden error, but technically it's not actually an error, but it is. So any wrong input or data, that could trigger an error. Now, when you run the application, you're probably not going to get an error because you know what you coded. But when a user does something, who knows what people are going to enter? People are crazy. The new syntax for this is actually try and accept. This is our try and accept statement. Now, there are more things you can use, but as I mentioned in this episode, I'm only going to brush on the basics. So let's focus on the try and accept statement, and maybe in VS Code I'll throw in one more. We basically want to try to run this code. If you were unable to run that code and it throws an error, I want you to handle the error this way. That's literally what this code translates to. You try to do something. If try fails, we use accept. Let's take a look at a code example. So in this super basic code example, really all it's doing is it's asking for two inputs and it's going to multiply the numbers together. It's then going to print off the area of that shape per se. So I have two variables, num1, num2, and I'm converting those through an input to an integer. I then have my variable area, and that's going to multiply those two inputs together before printing off my area. Now ask yourself, pause the program when I go back to the slides, right? What errors could happen? Now take a look, pause the video. Well, the possible error that we might face here is what if the user doesn't enter a number and they actually type the number out, like 9, N-I-N-E. That's not a number, that's a string, that's text. That's an error. So how could we solve this? Well, what if we used our try and accept statement? Now, I've done this very basic, right? I threw everything in a loop to ensure that this block continues to repeat. When we enter that loop, I ask for my input. I try to convert that input to an integer. Then I break my loop. I want to end or break my loop if I was able to convert that to an integer. If I'm not able to change that to a number, that's an error. I want to catch that error. And I want to print error, only enter a number. Great. I could have the same logic or the same type of code for the next number, and then on the outside I could do exactly what I wanted to do. That's probably the cleanest way to use a try and accept statement just while you're getting started. Remember, don't jump in the deep end. Walk in the shallow end. Practice. Okay. Another thing we can actually do here is, well, I could specify the exact type of error. So I'm catching this exact error. Now, if you do some Googling, you're going to realize there's only really like 9 errors in Python, and those are the most common ones we face. Every time you get an error, it's one of those errors. I can target one specifically and catch that. So here I'm catching 0 division error. If I tried to divide a number by 0, I would just say, you cannot divide by 0. But in reality, I'm never going to get that because I'm trying to multiply numbers. I then have an accept statement which then catches everything else. That is pretty cool. Now, once again, I can take this and put them together. So in the right here, I'm actually catching 2 specific errors. If either of these are triggered, then it's going to print this line. Every other error, it would print our final accept statement. Now that you understand the basics of exception handling, let's jump into your local IDE. For me, it's VS Code, and I want to play around with exception handling. Let's say I'm working with other files that aren't Python files, so like a text file or a JSON file, something like that. I could try, and I have a file. Let's say I want to open my file. My file could be called like sample.txt, it's a text file. And with this text file, I want to read it. So I have this. Now, I could go through and say, hey, for every line in my file, let's just print off each line. I want to read it. If I try to do that and it fails, let's throw an exception. But I'm going to target the specific kind of exception. If I don't have this file, that's one of the Python errors, and that error is file not found error. Hint, hint, it's not that hard. So I'm going to put here file not found error. If this occurs, I'm just going to print off and say like, you do not have this file. I'm going to run my code. And there you have it. You can see in the terminal, you do not have this file. It's being printed off right there. I just caught that error. Pretty cool. Remember, I have articles out about this. Look into the types of Python errors because you're going to get one of them. You can catch each one specifically. Let's play with another one. So I'm going to just turn this off for now. That's fine. Let's now go through and let's say I have a list. So I'm going to create a list with like, I don't know, numbers equals list. We can say 2, 4, 6, 7. That's my list of numbers. I want to go through and I want to like print off my numbers, but I want to index one of the numbers. Let's say like index 6. I do not have 6 elements in the list. It's going to throw an error. I don't have that. So I'm going to try that. I'm going to create my exception, right? So my exception in this case is going to be what we call an index error. If this index error occurs, then what I want to do is I'm just going to say out of range, ... And maybe I have another one that I specifically want to catch. Maybe I want to catch my division with 0, right? So 0 division error. What if I tried to divide this by the length of my list and the list was empty? Well, that would be dividing by 0. In this example, it wouldn't happen, but if you try to divide that to find the average or something, you would. So I could throw that in here, right? And I could just say, what could we say for that? Well, I could say, cannot divide by 0. All right, let's run that. Yep, we got our out of range. Okay. Now, one more key factor is I'm going to teach you one more. This wasn't in the slides, right? There is another part of the try and except statement, and that word is actually called finally. Now, finally, it's optional. You don't need it. In order to have a try and except statement for exception handling, you must use try and you must have except. Finally is optional. But no matter what happens in the code, finally will always run. If you have an error, it's going to run. If you do not have an error, it's going to run. So for example, if I print here and I just say win-win, I'm going to run this 2 times. The first time I still have my error. There we go, out of range, win-win. Let's go up here and let's change my index. Let's say index 1, which is going to be number 4. Let's run it. There we go, number 4, win-win. So finally is being ran no matter what happens. That's cool. Let's look at one more example. So let's just take like a longer example here, and I'm going to intentionally cause a few errors. Let's say the user has an input, and the user can enter a string or a number. Okay, so I'm giving them an option. I have a number, and this number is going to be if I can convert that input into a number. So if the user does enter a number, this part is going to succeed. If the user enters a string, well, that will throw an error, but I'm trying to plan for that. Additionally, let's create a variable called like results. And results is going to be 10 divided by the number. So start thinking, what errors could I have? Well, if I enter a string, that's one error. If I enter a 0, that's another error because I can't divide by 0. All right, now let's catch these. Let's create an except, and let's say, okay, I'm going to say here, I'm going to create the first one as a value error, and I'm going to do 2 of them. The other one here, which we saw in the example, is I'm going to say 0 division error. So if either of these are triggered, then I'm going to print this. And this can print enter a number that is not 0. That works well. Okay, let's create one more. Let's say, okay, there could be another type of exception. What if I had a type error? Well, if it was a different type that I've entered, then okay, I'm going to say cannot preform division with a string. That could happen, right? And then finally, well, I'm not going to say finally. I'm actually going to use the word else. So it's just like your conditional statements. So by saying else, no matter what happens, well, I do need a value. So when try succeeds, when try completes, with the value, I can now do something with that. That is what I'm putting in the else block. So right here, I could say something like results, and then let's put my variable results. Let's run our code a few times. The first time, I'm going to enter a string. So let's say 10, T-E-N, enter. Enter a number that is not 0. Okay, let's run it again. I'm going to enter 9, enter. Okay, sweet. I got my results back, right? So try succeeded, it went with my results. That is pretty amazing. You've been introduced to a lot. Remember, the key concept was try and except. But I did throw in finally and else as well. Congrats, Python crew. There you have it. In this episode, you now got the gist of exception handling. When it comes to exceptions, be specific. That is key. And tailor your code to the possible errors that could happen. Right? Remember what we learned in this episode and try to think ahead. What could happen? What could a user do that triggers an error? Hey guys, before you go, remember, if you're new here and you enjoyed what you learned, hit the subscribe button. That helps me create more content for you. And if you're looking for a handcrafted Python guide to get you started on the go, It's the first link in the description. Head on over and get yourself a free copy before next week's episode. As always, thanks for tuning in for this episode, and I can't wait to see you guys next week. Until then.